Okay, excellent. Now it's 3:32 here in Copenhagen, and we will get started. So welcome, everyone. You have signed in to the webcast, the online session called A Roadmap for Creating Transformational Change with Greg Satell and Pia Lauritsen. And my name is Marie Matheson, and I will be your host today. So I'm the CEO of Quest, and for those of you who don't know Quest, we are a company in Copenhagen that helps other companies drive transformation through the power of questions. So our customers use Quest, which is also the name of our digital tool, to succeed with their transformations and bridge the execution and implementation gap. My role today will be to guide us through this expert panel with Pia and Greg. And right now, with the coronavirus, I think that we're all thrown into this turmoil of unnormal working conditions where change and transformation really take center stage. And the primary purpose of today is to help you succeed better with the change and transformation challenges that you have. So we really, really want this to be helpful for you, and we want it to equip you to deal with the challenges you have better. So to that end, we've designed it. So first, Pia and Greg will present, but then we will also leave time for discussion and questions and answers at the end. And for that to really be helpful to you, we ask that you, as Pia and Greg are speaking, write your questions in the chat. So use the chat to put your input as the session is ongoing, and then we'll use that input to start the discussion session. Great. So let me introduce the expert panel. We have Greg with us today, which we're really happy and proud of. Greg is a best-selling author and speaker and innovation advisor. He has a passion for transforming big ideas into practical business applications. His most recent book is called Cascades. You see it right there, How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. And he's going to share some of the key ideas from that book with us today. Our other speaker is my co-founder, Pia Lauritsen, and she is the chief methodologist here at Quest. She also has a PhD in philosophy and has spent her career researching questions. Pia has written a number of books and articles on questions. And if you want an introduction to some of her philosophical work on questions, then I suggest that you watch her TED Talk, which is titled What You Don't Know About Questions. All right, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Pia.
Thank you, Marie. And hello, everybody. I feel like saying that it's very good to see you, but unfortunately I can't. So let me start by doing something else. I would like to start by doing something untraditional, because I would like to ask you to start. And the way I would like you to do that is to ask a question. So I would like you to use the chat box and write a question. And it can be any question, but it should be relevant to this webcast. And if you have a specific person in mind who you would like to answer the question, it could be Greg or maybe one of your colleagues or even yourself, please write that too. So just write a lot of questions that you would like answered. The chat should be working, or Mary, I can see people asking questions whether the chat is working.
For those of you who are asking that, we see your questions.
Yes, so the chat is definitely working.
Now something is happening. I can see a lot of questions now. Please just keep the questions coming.
You can also use the Q&A box.
Whoa, this is very interesting.
Pia, there's the question there about whether change is bottom up or top down, that we should make a note and address that in the
Definitely.
session. Some really, really good questions.
Definitely. We could do this all day. Would be great to see all questions. I definitely understand that. I can see that a lot of people didn't write a name or a specific person they would like to answer that question. That's okay. If some of you have a specific person in mind, feel free to write that as well.
And maybe we should just clarify that when you send your question, you can decide whether or not it goes to the panelists, which is Pia and Greg, or to everyone, and you decide how you want to submit it. That's completely fine.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. I will keep looking at the question, but I think I need to say something as well. So I will get back to the presentation. Just give me a second. Thank you. Well, the reason I asked you to ask a question, of course, is that I have a passion for questions and have spent a lot of time, 20 years, researching the nature and impact of questions. And what I found is that questions are the most powerful empowerment tool we have as human beings. So that's kind of, when you look at this triangle, you can see that by asking questions, human beings automatically connect to each other and to the world they share. In this visualization, you see one person asking, another person answering. And just by asking the question, they automatically connect to the subject matter of the question and to each other. I can take one of your questions just to give an example. I saw that Katarina wanted to ask everybody, which element are the most important to get right? I think that's a wonderful question. And by asking this question, Katarina tells us that what she thinks is important right now is prioritization. How do I prioritize? What is the most important to get right? And luckily, she wants to discuss this with all of us. So just by asking one question, we get Katarina's perspectives on what and who is important right now. So she shares her perspective on who and what. And by doing that, she also affects the way we think and talk about transformation. That's what I'm doing right now, being inspired by Katarina's question. So this is just Katarina's question. And unfortunately, I can't go through all your questions. And even if I could, we would probably have a hard time focusing. It would probably look like this, like most workshops do. And that is probably why most people don't ask their stakeholders to ask questions when they want to know what's on their minds. Instead, they collect answers to the questions they think is important. They use interviews or surveys where, as you can see in this visualization, this illustration, we have one person asking and a lot of people answering. It makes a lot of sense to do that. And it's very easy. We all know how easy it is. But just to demonstrate, let me do a poll right now. My question to you is, what tool would you use to find out what your colleagues think about a transformation that you're leading? And I think Marie will make sure that the poll is ready. You have 4 different choices. Maybe you would run a survey, or you would do a series of interviews. Maybe you would facilitate meetings or workshops, or you would do something completely else. Please answer this poll by picking one of these options.
Can you see the polls ticking in, Pia? Is it working?
I can see anything ticking in. Ticking.
I can.
You can. Oh, I want to know.
I don't know how to. I don't know how to change that actually, but
That's okay. If you can just tell me which one was the biggest.
yeah, but we still have 18% that still need to vote. So let's
okay,
give it.
I'll just be patient. Thank you.
But 85% of you have voted, so that's really excellent.
So the 85%, what did they say?
Yes, I will tell you.
The
The most selected option is meetings and workshops.
Okay.
Followed by interviews.
Can we get some numbers? Meetings and workshops?
So 49% say meetings and workshops. 30%, 31% say interviews. I think this will launch to everyone when I end the poll, which I'll do shortly. And then surveys is 10% and something else is 9%. And we have a participation rate of 88% right now. So I think I'll just end it and then we will see it, all of us.
That's great. Yes, thank you, Marie. So meetings and workshop. Well, that, I think we can all agree that was actually very easy. And now I know that most of you would prefer to do meetings or workshops when you want to know what's on your stakeholders' minds. Unfortunately, that's all I know. I don't know why you prefer to run meetings and workshops. I don't know what your considerations are. And because all I have is a couple of numbers, I don't know what to say and what to do to make you feel part of my project. And worst of all, I don't know how to empower you to do anything about it. So for us to leverage the most powerful empowerment tool, we must disrupt the survey logic. We must let people ask their own questions. It should look more like this. So that is what we designed the Quest software to do. Let me tell you what Quest is. You can think about Quest as a flipped survey, where the participants ask each other questions about important topics. Change leaders and executives use Quest to tap into the collective knowledge of their stakeholders and at the same time secure buy-in. So instead of depending on a facilitator to ask the right questions in a workshop or in a survey or an interview, and instead of depending on a facilitator to read out loud and make sense out of your questions like you were a couple of minutes ago, the questions you asked in a chat box, Quest makes it easy for a large group of people to join a conversation about an important topic. All you have to do as a change leader or as an executive is to define a topic and invite a relevant group of people, of stakeholders, to join your Quest. When the Quest starts, each participant gets the chance and is prompted to ask a question and pick another participant who they want to answer the question. The participants the participant who receives question, they answer and then they pass on the relay by asking a new question of another participant. So this goes on for a couple of days usually, and when the Quest closes, the output, all the questions and answers are automatically analyzed and shared with everybody. So this way, the software makes it very easy for everybody to take part in your transformation. I can talk about this for hours, and I usually do. But as you know, we've teamed up with Greg Satell. And Greg has so many interesting things to say about transformation. So I'm very happy to hand it over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Pia. And for anybody who hasn't actually tried the Quest software, I really recommend you try demo, because no presentation could really do it justice. It's just incredibly intuitive and creates this great collaborative process for identifying problems and driving change, which is our subject today. And I think the subject of change and transformation has never been more important than it is now. So I'd like to start with just a little bit about how change itself has changed. And consider this, back in 1975, 83% of corporate assets were tangible, things like factories and buildings and real estate. So back then, what change meant a shift in some tangible asset, a strategic type of move. So when change management got started back in the early 80s, that's the type of problem it was designed to address. How to bring people along with the strategic decision that had already been made. But by 2015, that had flipped. Today, 84% of corporate assets are intangible, things like patents and licenses and human capital. So that means change is completely different. It means that when we talk about change today, we're actually talking about changes with people, what they believe, how they think, how they act. That's a very, very different thing. So change management is how we need to address change is completely different, but change management hasn't kept up. It's amazing. It's like we have this sort of army of consultants out there, stuck in 1975 and trying to, I don't know, teach people how to DJ with cassette tapes. Of course, now we've probably half the audience is Googling what a cassette tape is. But the point is we can see why that transformation usually fails. And research from McKinsey suggests that only 26% of transformation efforts succeed. And clearly, we have to do better than that. I remember when I first really understood the importance of change. It was in Kiev, Ukraine in 2004. And I woke up early one Saturday morning to find that my fiance was not only already awake, but fully dressed and heading out the door. So I asked her, "Where are you going?" And she said, oh, I'm heading out to a demonstration. And I said, "But I thought you don't care about politics." She said, "Well, I didn't, but it's enough already, and we have to do something." And with that, she put on that orange bandana you can see there and headed out. And just like that, like somebody flipped a switch somewhere. It was like the entire country had changed overnight. All of a sudden, everybody we knew were heading out to political demonstrations on a regular basis, something that would have seemed bizarre just a short time before. And that's what led just a few months later to the events we know now as the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And I experienced these events from a very unique perspective, because as a foreigner, I was something of an outsider. But in my role, managing the country's leading news organization, I was certainly much more than a casual bystander. And what I remember most about that time was this incredible feeling of confusion. Nobody seemed to really understand what was going on or what would happen next. Not the journalists I would speak to in the newsrooms every day, not the other business leaders, not the political leaders that I would run into from time to time. Nobody with any conventional form of power seemed to have any ability to shape events at all. All there was this mysterious force that nobody could describe, but nobody could deny, that was moving events along. And what amazed me was how thousands upon thousands of people who'd ordinarily be doing very, very different things would all of a sudden stop what they were doing and start doing the same thing in almost perfect unison. And running a large organization at the time, I thought to myself, I'd really like to do that, because I've got these thousands upon thousands of potential customers, and I'd really like them to unite on the one thing I was trying to sell them. And I had hundreds of employees, all, really bright and ambitious people, all with their own ideas. But I wanted them to embrace the one or two initiatives that I thought needed to be priorities. And similar with advertisers and investors, but I had no idea how to do that. And then just a few years later, I was in Silicon Valley. It was 2006. Everybody was talking about social networks. And I thought this is something I should really learn about. And I started researching network science. And what I found was that there was a nearly perfect mathematical explanation for almost everything that happened in the Orange Revolution. And I found that scientists had known about this mysterious force for centuries, and in fact, had a name for it. It's called a network cascade. And in the late 90s, some breakthroughs in network science actually shed a lot of light on how these things happen, how cascades happen, and how they drive transformational change. And in the book, I go into quite a bit of detail, and we also go into some depth in workshops, but just in the interest of time, I want to cut to the chase so that we get more time to answer your questions. And tell you that it's small groups, loosely connected, united by a shared purpose. In a nutshell, that's how a cascade happens. So anybody who's really familiar with traditional change management will probably notice that sort of flips things on its head. Traditional change management tells us that we need to start with a bang. We need to create a sense of urgency around the change and get commitment through a big communication campaign. And that worked when change meant a change in tangible assets. But when we're talking about changes in what people do and how they think, any change, if it's going to be anything more than incremental, there's some people who really aren't going to like it. And they're going to do whatever they can to undermine it, often in very underhanded and dishonest ways. So by trying to start with a big bang, a big communication campaign, we're not only rallying people to our side, we're alerting those people who want to stop change that they better get started undermining or it actually might happen. So we're much better off identifying small groups who are already enthusiastic about the change and empowering them to connect with each other and unifying them with the shared purpose. I think one of the things I think it's important to point out is that this is a natural law. It works this way, whether it's people in a movement or molecules in a biological system or computers in a network. And this is what really got me hooked and started me on my 15-year-long quest to understand how transformation happens. And that's what led to my book, Cascades. And what I found is that much like Tolstoy said about families, all successful movements end up looking very much alike, but unsuccessful transformations fail in their own way. And what I found is that there are common principles that we can use to drive change, whether it's a political revolution, a social movement, or an organizational or industrial change. We're going to go over 4 of these principles today. We go into, again, quite a bit more depth in workshops. But today, I just want to focus on these 4, and I'm going to go very, very quickly. So if you have a question, put it in the chat box, and we'll get to it later. But I want to move quickly so that we can get to your questions. So the first principle is called a keystone change. And Pia, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, great. And actually the next one as well. So the story that I think really encapsulates what a keystone change is Gandhi and the Salt March. Today, we remember the Salt March as Gandhi's greatest triumph. But when he first announced that he was going to march against the salt laws, his allies in the Indian National Congress, they thought it was some sort of a joke. They said, we want freedom. We want independence from Great Britain. We want justice. And you're marching for salt. I mean, it seems so petty, but what Gandhi understood was that salt and the salt laws was a keystone change. And can we go to the next one? And every change effort starts off with a list of grievances. Sales are down, or our customers hate us, or all of our employees are leaving, or we can't go to the office and have an in-person meeting because of a coronavirus. And Gandhi's movement started out like that as well. Started off with the grievance. Indians had a bunch of English guys in their country running things and telling them what to do, and they didn't like it. But change only starts when you are able to transform those grievances into a vision of tomorrow. And Gandhi had that as well. They wanted full independence from Great Britain. That was the vision of tomorrow. But what Gandhi understood, and almost nobody else did at the time, was that you can't get there in one step. And that's the genius of the Keystone Change. And that's what the Salt March was. A Keystone Change has 3 criteria. First, it's a clear and tangible goal, which the Salt March had. It was they wanted the salt laws repealed. Second, it involved multiple stakeholders, and this is supremely important. In traditional change management, people often talk about a quick and easy win. Well, a quick and easy win isn't going to be meaningful unless it involves multiple stakeholders, if it's just happening in the IT department or something. And the Salt March certainly did that. It didn't matter whether you were Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or Christian or upper caste or lower caste. You needed salt to live. And the salt laws were seen as fundamentally unjust, even by many back in Great Britain. So they were an easy target, and it paves the way for future change. And the Salt March certainly did that. It showed that the British could be defied. And once that happened, independence was just a matter of time. And India did indeed become independent in 1947. What I found in my research is it doesn't matter whether it's a political revolution like Gandhi's, a social movement, or an organizational transformation. All successful transformations start with a keystone change. And here's 5 great examples. The big turnaround at Alcoa back in the 80s, IBM, the famous turnaround that Lou Gerstner did in the 90s. Much less well known, but very impressive, was a movement to transform Wyeth Pharmaceuticals with lean manufacturing techniques. That was around 2009 or 2010, somewhere around there. Very recently, a cloud computing transformation at Experian, and also a digital transformation at Procter & Gamble. So very, very different organizations, very, very different times, very, very different industries, but they all started with a keystone change. So if you want to drive transformation in your organization or in your community or throughout society as a whole, that's where you really want to start, with the keystone change. And now I'm going to send things back to Pia for just a minute, and she's going to explain how you can use the Quest software to help you identify a good keystone change.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, well, let's say that Greg wants to kick off a quest about agile transformation in his company. Then what he would do is that he would start by creating a quest page, explaining why agile transformation is important to the company. And then he would invite his key stakeholders to join the quest, motivating them by saying that he needs help to find out where to start. Where do we start with? We need to make this agile transformation a success. And I can imagine that he would invite advanced business analysts, development consultants, department managers, and a lot of other stakeholders who he depends on to make the transformation a success. Now, if Greg didn't have Quest, it would probably be difficult for him to get these busy people to meet. and for them to discuss the implications of agile transformation. But with Quest, he can initiate a real-time conversation across divisions, locations, and time zones in a few hours. And the data he gets from the peer-to-peer conversations and questions and answers among his stakeholders gives him valuable insight about which division or team or project or process best meet the keystone change criteria. So you can use Quest to identify his keystone change. I would, of course, suggest that you do that, Greg. But for now, I just want to give the word back to you so you can continue.
Great. So the next principle is making a plan. And obviously, change doesn't just happen by itself. You need to start with a plan. And there are two tools that have been literally battle tested for decades that we can use to help us make a plan for change. The first one is called the spectrum of allies. And it's pretty simple and straightforward. Much like a general will map the terrain upon which a military battle is fought, you want to map the terrain upon which the battle for change will be fought. And the spectrum of allies is something that helps you do that. So you want to identify who are your most active allies, who are passive allies, who are neutral, who's passive opposition, and who's your most active opposition. And two things I think is really important to point out about the spectrum of allies is, number one, as much as possible, you want to avoid engaging with your most active opposition because they're never going to agree. And they're going to do everything that you can to undermine you. So especially in the early stages, you want to avoid those people. They're going to suck out all the energy. And you want to focus mostly on empowering people who are already enthusiastic about this change so that they can bring in others and others still. One of the things we found in our research, and it's amazing how consistent this behavior is, once that active opposition sees you starting to gain traction, often, and by very often I mean almost always, they will lash out and they will overreach and they will end up sending people your way. The other point is that you need to identify shared values that are shared among at least 4 of these 5 groups. Pia gave the example of agile development. And agile development is something that people are incredibly passionate about because it has these great differentiating values, has a whole agile manifesto. And people who are agile, who are passionate about agile will talk about things like why you don't really need technical requirements and you should focus on user stories. And this is something that they feel really strongly about, but doesn't mean anything to people outside the agile community. So by talking about those differentiating values, often they get people to think they're a little nuts, which is why it's so important to focus on shared values, which for agile would be things like better projects that are done on time and on budget. Who could be against that? So it's really, really powerful when we do this in workshops. We get people to shift from those differentiating values that make them passionate about an idea to shared values that will invite people in. So that's the spectrum of allies. The next tool is called the pillars of support. And to understand this, imagine an all-powerful dictator, someone like Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-un. And now imagine that one day all the janitors decide not to come into work one day. And now that all-powerful dictator is almost powerless to get the trash picked up. I mean, he can shoot all the janitors, but that still isn't going to get the trash picked up. The point is that every regime or every status quo depends on institutions to support it. So if you want to make change happen, you need to identify those institutions, not to knock them out, but to pull them in. Because it's by influencing institutions that we can actually make change happen. So in a typical political revolution, it'll be things like this: the military, the police, the justice system, the media, business leaders, organized religions. And if you go back through political revolutions the ones that succeeded throughout history, you'll find that they succeeded by influencing those institutions. Think of someone like Martin Luther King, who didn't write a single piece of legislation or decide a single court case, but by mobilizing people to to influence those institutions, he was able to create an enormous amount of change. Now, of course, in an organizational setting, those pillars and those institutions are going to be very different. Things like we have here, customer groups, industry associations, education, especially universities, division heads, investors, regulatory agencies. We see a vast array of different institutions in our workshops. Sometimes they are things like labor groups or NGOs. For instance, in artificial intelligence right now, all the big tech companies are working with organizations like the ACLU because they understand that they're a very important institutions. So when we're designing tactics, this is very, very important. When we're designing tactics, can we go to the next slide here? We always want to be mobilizing constituencies within the spectrum of allies to influence institutions in the pillars of support. We're always mobilizing somebody to influence something. And those are the two questions we want to ask about each and every action we take. Who are we mobilizing, and to influence what? The next principle is how we scale. And we scale through weaving the network. And I'm going to send it back to Pia here for a minute so she can explain how you can use Quest to help you identify spectrum of allies and pillars of support and help you weave the network.
Yes, thank you, Greg. Yeah, well, you can see that by this peer-to-peer question and answer exchanges between your stakeholders. Quest allows you to analyze your informal conversation network, and thereby you identify your active as well as your passive allies, because you can see who people turn to, and you can see what they talk about. So, and the next step would usually be that you make an analysis of the content of the questions. I noticed a lot of you asked, could we see the other participants' questions in the chat box? Because we are all curious about each other's questions. And Quest allows that. It happens automatically that everybody gets access to each other's questions. But by analyzing the content of the questions and sorting them into themes, you can also identify the shared values. Like in the example of agile transformation, people might value productivity and alignment over customer success and innovation, like this pie chart suggests. And when you know that, when you know who people turn to, and you also know what they value, or what they care about, you can design your approach to relevant pillars of support. So about weaving the network, if you can actually map and combine this knowledge about who people turn to and what they talk about, you have a possibility of observing the network as it happens. It doesn't have to be a theoretical construct. It can be something that you observe while it's emerging. So by combining the informal network, showing how people communicate, and the rich conversational data about what they talk about and what they care about, you can actually see the movement for change is beginning to scale. And you can use this real-time visualization to stay up to date on whether the shared values stay the same, they stay constant, or whether they are evolving. The next step would be to allow your active allies to use Quest themselves. Because if you do that, you empower them to constantly bring in others. And by doing that, you make the connection between the small groups that allows you to scale your transformation throughout the whole organization. Of course, I would love to show you more and give you a demo if you would like that. But I'm not going into more details right now. If you have questions about Quest, please remember to share them in the chat box. Right now, get back to you, Greg.
Yeah, before I go further with the last principle, surviving victory, I saw a very, very interesting question in the chat box. So I'm going to jump the gun and address it right now. A bunch of people are asking, what's the keystone change now with COVID, and is social distancing a keystone change? Actually, it's not. Social distancing is a tactic. The keystone change is flattening the curve. I would think. So, but very, very interesting question, I thought that was. So we want to get to the final principle that we're going to cover today. And it's a really important one. It's called surviving victory. For example, and one of the most interesting things I found in my research was how dangerous the victory phase is and how often movements for change fail in the victory phase. That certainly happened to us in Ukraine. We thought we had won in 2005. Turns out we didn't, which is why there was another revolution in 2013 and 14. It would have been nice if we could have gotten that right the first time around. We've also seen this in the Arab Spring, where in Egypt, for example, they got rid of Mubarak and ended up with al-Sisi. Again, failed to survive victory. And I think in all of our professional lives, we've seen that when we think we've won, when we get our program budgeted or get executive sponsorship, often that seems exactly that moment when all of a sudden somebody throws a bunch of sand in the gears. And the reason why that happens is because we tend to take our eye off the ball when we feel like we've won. But that active opposition, those people who hate our idea and will do anything to undermine it, they don't just simply disappear. They're still there. And they're usually redoubling their efforts. So we need to focus on how we're going to survive victory and anticipate. And in workshops, we ask these three questions to help people do that. First, how would an evil person undermine the change that you seek in a completely dishonest way? And once you start to imagine that, you can see what will probably happen. So it's really important to anticipate that. And then go to the next stage and say, okay, now we understand how we're going to be attacked, but where are we vulnerable? Where are we most likely to be attacked? And then third, how can we appeal to shared values to overcome opposition, to mitigate those attacks? And how can we take that initial movement for change and apply those shared values to the next change and the next one after that? For instance, once we've succeeded with our agile transformation, how do we remind people it was never about agile? It was about better projects. And how do we make projects better and better and better after that? And so before we go to discussion, I just want to leave you with one final thought. And that is that transformation is always a journey, never a destination. And one of the most heartening things I found in my research of movements throughout history is that they all failed at some point. And the ones that succeeded weren't necessarily any more smarter or committed or anything like that. It was the people who learned along the way. Movements, as the name implies, are always kinetic. They always start in one place and go to somewhere else. So think about your transformation as a journey, not any particular destination. Now I'm going to send things back to Marie, who's going to help us run things for the rest of the webcast.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And thank you also to you, Pia. So this is the moment where it's all about you guys, all the attendees that we have joining us, where we really want to take this chance with our experts to get them to answer some of the questions that you have. And I have been jotting down some notes from the questions that have already tickled in, but don't hold back. Please keep them coming in the chat box and we'll see how many we can get to. And we'll of course also keep them so that we can potentially answer them in another way later as well. So Greg and Pia, I will say that I saw some themes here. I saw something about, resistance and tension. And I think that, Greg, if you could speak to that a little bit. There's one question that says, how do you overcome resistance to change given that the reasons for resistance are so varied? Differentiated approaches, perhaps. So the question maybe already has a suggested answer in it, but could you speak a little bit to that? That would be great.
Yeah, a lot of things we talk about in the innovation community are, corporate antibodies and this corporate immune system, which of course is a complete fiction. No such thing exists. There's just people who don't like your idea. So the thing you want to do with your resistance is, at first, in the early stage, you want to avoid them and focus your efforts on empowering people who are already enthusiastic about your idea. And that's where the keystone change comes in. Before you get to that keystone change, when you're first starting out, you're never exactly sure the change or how to go about it or how to make things work. So you want to focus on people who are like-minded and actually want it to work. Then once you're successful with the keystone change, and you can and you've had success with it, then you can bring in others and others still. And only in the later stages, middle to late stages, do you want to start addressing resistance. In the beginning, you don't even want them to really know about or be aware of it until you're actually starting to gain traction. So again, and this is really important, you want to avoid engaging with your most active opposition, especially in the beginning, because they're just trying to undermine you, and chances are you're never going to convince them. In the later stages, when you've already gained traction, well, then if this is a successful change becomes a performance issue. And we've seen this consistently, where, for instance, at Experian in the cloud, once they were a year or so into it, it became an issue. Oh, those guys over there, those business heads over there, they're doing great with cloud solutions, and you haven't done anything. And then in the later stages, by year 2 or into year 3, first of all, a lot of people had left because they didn't like it, and the ones that stayed around and were embittered, well, there were so few of them at that point, you could just fire them.
I think it's very interesting, and it's also, I think, very counterintuitive to what should we say, sort of traditional or dominant approaches to sort of say, don't engage with your critics in the beginning. So I think it's really fascinating, and one of those places where the cross-fertilization between the social science and seeing how societies change and companies can really be useful for us. There is another question that has, where would you start with a
I was also interested in what Pia had to say about it as well.
Yes. Pia, what are you there?
Yeah. Actually, I don't have anything to say right now. I think you said some interesting things, so I think we should move on. I'm interested in the questions.
Sorry, you were looking. I thought you had something to say.
I just want to know the questions.
But actually, there was just somebody in the chat that wrote, is there a discrepancy between Greg's approach to resistance and the Quest tool? Which I think is really a perceptive and cool question for you, Pia. So is there some tension between what Greg talks about when it comes to resistance and the Quest tool?
I wouldn't say that there's a tension, but it wasn't part of the initial Quest idea that you should focus on the people, your active allies. The initial thought and the initial way of working with questions from Quest is to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask the questions that matter the most to them. Because I think most of the tensions or oppositions, sometimes at least, it comes down to people not feeling part of whatever they need to be part of. And if you invite them to ask their own questions and be part of this, my experience is that often they don't feel that anger or frustration or fear anymore, because now they feel empowered to do something about it, and they take responsibility for doing something about it. So I wouldn't say that it's a tension, but it's definitely not the same way of approaching human beings when it comes to, should I avoid them or should I draw them in? I think you can benefit from listening to the questions people ask, even though they are from the opposition.
Great.
And I would also point out that I think in software like Quest, what that really means is you don't want to force people to engage. Generally speaking, when people are really against an idea and it first comes up, they'll be quiet, they'll lurk. So you don't want to force them into the conversation, but you will also recognize who is who's really, really enthusiastic. Would it be okay if I picked out a question, because I saw one from Peter that I think is really important and interesting, where how do you make a common value like productivity into a concrete and actionable change? And I think it's really important to make a distinction between the two. When you're talking about a change, you're talking about that's a vision for tomorrow. Productivity is not a real concrete vision of how you want things to go. A value is something that constrains you. It doesn't tell you what to do. It'll tell you what you don't want to do. So for example, and that's mainly with differentiating values. So with a common value like productivity, that's not what's driving your change. That's how you're presenting the change to others who might not get it. So with agile transformation, it's obviously, if you would just say, productive change management, well, that's absolutely meaningless. Agile is a very, very distinct set of ideas and values. The thing is that that's not what's going to bring people in. So it's really important that you're focusing when you're presenting to people that this is going to make you more productive. That's not a tactic. That's just how you're trying to meet people where they already are, instead of expecting them to come to where you want them to be. That's not how you start with people. Does that make I hope that makes sense. Maybe Peter can reply whether I answered his question, because I think it's a really important one.
I think he's happy. That's what it says. I think there's one that I think both of you, I would love to hear your considerations about that. Maybe we'll start with you, Pia, where I think it is, oh, now they're zooming by me. Here we are. I think it's Marianne who says, given that shared values are so important as a cornerstone for successful change, how do you go about defining, agreed on the values and the meaning behind these? So Pia, I know that you have some thinking on this sort of shared purpose, shared value ideas so I'd like you to talk to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question. I don't think that you should start by defining or insisting on agreeing. I think the shared values and the shared purpose, for that matter, I think it's already there. But what you need to do, and what you need to do as a group, or as a company, as a department, is to help each other explore how it works and why what is important to you. So I think that it's we have been talking a little bit about how this is different from traditional change management and maybe from management as well. I think we spend too much time insisting on that we should define and agree. I think we should have a lot of shared experiences with stuff. Because if we have shared experiences with the discussions that really matters and the problems that really matters to our company, then I think that we don't have to agree. I think we can just agree on exploring and solving problems together. And if we agree on that, then I think, yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, but I kind of like the idea of turning the our energy towards something else than definitions and agreement.
Thank you.
I'd like to give a few examples, because values and the genome of values is something we spend, there's a whole chapter on it in the book, and it's something we spend quite a bit of time on in the workshops. And I think it's really, really important, because values are constraints. So 2 examples we give in the workshop. One is Nelson Mandela, who throughout his career was accused of being a anarchist, a communist, an extremist, and worse. And whenever he was confronted with these accusations, he would always say the same thing. He would say, nobody has to guess what I believe or what I'm fighting for, because it was all written down in 1955. It was called the Freedom Charter. And it wasn't just the African National Congress, his organization, who came up with it. They had a Congress of the People, I think something like 300 organizations. And Mandela would later say that the Freedom Charter would certainly have been different if it was written strictly by the ANC. But because they brought in a multi-ethnic and very diverse coalition, it was far more powerful. And even today in South Africa, the Freedom Charter is recognized as one of the most powerful documents in history, up there with, say, our Declaration of Independence in America. And I think one of the great corporate examples, and one we point to a lot, is Gerstner's transformation of IBM in the 90s, where a big part of it was focusing on customer, focusing on the customer, as he put it, to shift it from a proprietary stack of technology to the customer's stack of business processes. And I've interviewed dozens of IBM executives over the years, from rank and file to very, very senior, and all of them, they all talk about it was one thing that made that transformation work, that made everybody understand that Gerstner was really serious, and that was that he was willing to lose money on every single sale to do what was right for the customer. And that's what signaled to not only people internally, but partners, investors, analysts, and all those other stakeholders. We were talking before about the pillars of support. That's what signaled to all those institutions that he needed to influence that this change was real, because values are ways that we constrain ourselves.
Great, thank you. So we'll go to the next question that I pick out. This is like the all-powerful position in this. I like it. So here's a question that I will ask Pia to answer. It comes from Karen Marie, and it is, how does culture impact people's eagerness to ask questions, also the more sensitive and unpopular ones? And I know there was another question on questions, sort of the roles of questions as a tool. So I think this would be great, Pia, for you to answer.
Yes, definitely. I think I know culture has a lot of, a very big impact on people's eagerness to ask questions. And I think that it's very important that you, as a change leader or a leader, make sure to emphasize that this is about allowing people to ask the questions that matter to them. And it's not a matter of finding the right answers. It's not a matter of asking good or bad questions. It's a matter of finding out what matters in real day work. And that is very important when you set up your quest and you motivate people to join your quest. And even if you do that, you risk the first couple of times when you run a quest that people will be careful and maybe they will need some proofs that this is actually what you want, because we're not used to the fact that this is what people want. Usually people want answers, and they want the right answers. And they want people to know what they are talking about. They don't want people to explore. Maybe a lot of organizations talk about innovation and they want to disrupt things and think out of the box and do things differently. But we have a lot of structures keeping us in this mindset of delivering answers. Even the tools, as I talked about earlier, the tools we use with surveys and interviews, people are so used to being reduced to respondents. They should only respond to whatever comes from C-level management or consultants. So it's not their job to ask questions. So it can take some time. At the same time, it's my experience, and I think it's everybody's experience, that it's a basic human, it's part of our nature to ask questions. Our children do it from they're very, very small. So the minute we realize that this is actually our job now, I'm supposed to ask questions, people know what to do. And they are very good at it, and they enjoy asking questions because it makes themselves evolve. So everybody really enjoys the question and answer exchanges. I can see that's what's happening here in the chat box as well. So it could take some time getting used to or feeling safe that this is the job. But when you do that, it's a party.
Thank you. One thing I would like to bring us back to is in the beginning, there was a question about the bottom up, top down, or inside out movement. And I think that we should go back there and make sure that we get that answered, because I saw that pop up a few times.
This is an interesting one because this is actually how Pia and I connected, right?
Yes.
And I have an article about this, that change isn't really top down or bottom up. It tends to be side to side. And when we're talking about change, and if you think about the spectrum of allies, it really doesn't matter if somebody's very, very senior or very, very junior or somewhere in the middle, whether they're going to dislike or like your idea, or whether they're going to be an ally or an opposition. The important thing is that you're focusing in the beginning on people who are already enthusiastic about this idea. The network scientist, Duncan Watts, calls it easily influenced people influencing other easily influenced people. And we go into quite a bit of detail in the book and the workshops about exactly how this happens. But in the beginning, you want to start with those people, and then move along to, as you're bringing in people who are more passive or neutral, or even maybe passively opposed. That really doesn't depend on someone's seniority. And one of the examples I love, which I actually came across after the book was written, and it was actually a couple of guys who had read the book and used it to drive the change. It was at Procter & Gamble, and it was just 3 guys who were working together. I think it was like an IT guy, a research guy, and somebody else. And they saw this one process that took weeks and was a real bottleneck. And they said, we're going to fix this process. We think we can take it from weeks down to a few hours. And they didn't ask permission from anybody. They didn't, they just saw a problem, got to work on fixing it. And I think it was within 6 or 8 months, they were able to take that process, which had taken weeks, and take it down to a few hours. And that got them recognition. And from there, they built a movement across Procter & Gamble, across the whole research organization, which I think now encompasses thousands of people in this. It's called PXG, that's focused on helping people use digital solutions to improve processes across the organization. So in that case, it was just some guys in the middle, and they didn't ask anybody's permission. The CTO, once she saw what they did, she immediately jumped on board, but it was opt-in. they weren't forcing anybody to do anything. But now that they've, I think they're about 18 months into it, now that they've had such success and have created so many productive solutions with all the people who they've brought in, it's a very, very compelling proposition because it works. And those who aren't on board, well, they're not as productive. And those who are actively opposing, now it's on them to say why they're opposing these digital transformation techniques, because they've had such success. If they tried to convince those people in the beginning, it would have been on them to convince others why they should adopt it. They didn't have to convince anybody. They just got people together and actually made it work. So I think that's one of my favorite examples.
Awesome, thank you. Let me switch the perspective to leadership, because there's a couple of questions from was it Ralph and David that have to do with what does this actually take from leaders? And Pia, I would like you to speak to this. The latter part, I'm not going to read all the questions. You can see them in the chat. Maybe actually all the participants can't. But I'll read the latter part of Ralph's question, which is asking a leader to ask questions and not give answers, thereby letting their power go free to the people, the employees. How do you see the power issue here, and how do we transform that? So Pia, what thoughts come to mind for that question?
Well, I definitely think it's interesting, and it's very hard for a lot of leaders to find a way to deal with the fact that not only do they not know all the answers, maybe they don't even know the right questions, or the questions that have the most that creates the most problems and are most vital for them to address. Maybe they don't even know the questions. And I think what most leaders realize when some leaders they are just being, their way of being in the world is a way of acknowledging that, of course, I don't know all the answers or the questions. I'm a human being, and that's a fact, and I should just embrace that, and I should allow my employees to embrace it as well. But there are also a lot of leaders who don't think that way. And if they have a mindset of, if I'm not in control, if I don't have the answers and know what to ask, then nobody does, and then everything will be very bad. Then it's difficult to accept the fact that they don't, and they should make room. But all the leaders, and I'm a former management consultant, and I have a lot of customers who were, kind of scared to let go. But they all realized that when people get the chance to both ask questions and answer questions, they take responsibility for the problems as well as the solutions. So I think, and I even have a customer, he became a friend, who said that it was kind of, it was tough saying, I just have to make this leap of faith and trust that my employees know what to do with this. But when I did, I was just amazed, because of course they did. And they had all this knowledge that I don't, because I'm not dealing with customers every day. I'm not solving problems that has to do with everyday situations. So I depend on these people to ask questions and provide answers. So I think it's a matter of experience, making sure that everybody gets the experience of this being something we can do together and should do together, because otherwise we will fail.
And can I ask you to reflect on that, because there's been a bunch of questions also about the current COVID-19 and Corona and so on. So is this, how does the situation we're facing right now, where, we all sort of have to follow leadership and they have to make decisions. We had a very funky press conference here in Denmark recently with our Prime Minister. The US has a interesting leadership in place and so on. So is this just, what reflections do you have in light of that?
Well, I think,
go ahead, sorry.
I I think it's very obvious right now that nobody has the answers. And when nobody has the answers, we all have to listen more carefully to the questions. And to the questions we ask ourselves and each other, and maybe also the questions we forgot to ask ourselves and each other when everything seemed normal. Right now, we have to ask those questions, and we have to be able to listen to each other's questions. So it's a new exercise for a lot of people, but it's not difficult. We just need to remember that this is our job right now. Nobody knows the answers. And I can see that Rasmus asked a question about if we agree that leaders ask questions and managers give answers. No, I definitely don't agree on that. Or maybe that's what happens, but that's not what should happen. It should be the case that everybody does both. Ask questions, provide answers, because then everybody is responsible for both solving the problems and identifying the problems. But Greg, I know you have something to say about this as well.
Yeah, I think what we need to realize is this present situation is the result of a failure to transform. That's why we are where we are. And I know I keep coming back to this point, but just let me stress it. So, and I think there's a great quote where an engineer, I think from IBM, said, "Don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If your idea is any good, you're going to have to ram it down their throats anyway." And I think that one of the things that a sort of undercurrent of a lot of these questions is, how do we get everybody to love our idea? Well, let me break the suspense for you. If your idea is at all important, some people are going to hate it, and they'll do whatever they can to stop it. And we've seen that in this. There were people who were calling for, in America, the CDC and the NIH to be defunded. So that's the reality. That's what you have to deal with. So don't think that, and one of the things I like to say is, anybody who's ever been married or had kids knows how difficult it can be to convince even one person of something they don't want to be convinced about, right? But if, for instance, I'm out with my wife and we're with 8 other people and all of them agree and she's the one holdout, she still might not agree, but at least my percentages are going to get better. So instead of trying to convince people who never want to be convinced, go find people who are as excited about the idea as you are, and go out and start making things happen, like Gandhi did with the Salt March, like those 3 guys at Procter & Gamble did. If you go into my book, if you read my book, you see countless examples, some famous, some really obscure, of people who decided a change was important and figured they're not going to wait for anybody else, and went and made change happen. And once people see change happening and it being effective, that's how you bring people along.
Thank you. So I think I'm gonna do just a time check here and say we'll do a few more, a question for you, Pia, and a question for you, Greg, and then we'll wrap up. So if anybody has some comments that you want us to consider and so on, now is the time to throw them in the chat. Pia, I would like you to sort of have your last bit of input in today's session to be sort of about questions as a tool. I think there was also a question about how can you use questions to change people's mind. So in this sort of like, what is this magical power of questions that you've spent your career thinking about?
Well, I don't think you should think about questions as a tool to change people's minds. I think you should think about questions as this very, very magical, I don't know what to call it, but it's kind of like, I remember I was about to give an interview to some media, and before leaving I asked my daughter, why do you ask questions? And she wasn't very old, at the moment, and she asked a lot of questions. So I asked her, why do you ask questions? And then her answer actually surprised me, because I would think she would say something like, I want to know stuff, or I'm curious, or something like that. But what she said was, this little girl, she said, because maybe we will get to talk about something interesting. So she doesn't know yet, but she knows that by asking questions, there's a big chance that we will get at some point where something will be interesting, and we will do it together. So she cannot just sit at home asking her own questions. She needs to find someone to connect with in exploring the world. And that is what kids, that's what it's all about. And I believe it should be what it's all about for grown-ups as well, and for companies and communities. We need to invite each other to explore stuff along with us, because when we do that, maybe something gets interesting. And I think that's the way we should think about questions. We can solve problems, and we can connect, and we can see opportunities that would otherwise we would be blind for them, but we can tap into this magic by allowing each other to ask questions.
Thank you. And Greg, then I'll end with you and a question that I think is it's kind of cool, where a person asked, you know, how can we fast track transformation? Because I know that speed is also something that you don't think it needs to take so much time, and you're very aware that transformations actually can waste a lot of time if you do the wrong things. So what is your advice for people who are saying, my resources are limited, time is short, like how can I fast track change?
Well, first of all, I would say you can't fast track change. I mean, transformation takes time. We're not talking about small changes here. You know, if you think about LGBT rights, that took 30, 40 years. If you think the transformation, the cloud transformation at Experian, and this was actually started by the CIO, it took about 3 years to really complete the transformation to the cloud. And now they're using those same things to those same structures that they built for that transformation to create another transformation with artificial intelligence. So to that full transformation, it's going to take time, but you can start today. I mean, again, I point to those guys at Procter and Gamble. They didn't ask, they just got started. They got down to work. You can start today. You can make a change no matter how small. And also, I wouldn't worry about mistakes. Of course, mistakes are going to slow you down, but everybody makes them. Again, one of the interesting things I found in my research is every major change made mistakes. And one of the most important things that change leaders do is they change themselves. Gandhi, even famous ones, when Gandhi started out, he started out as an attorney, and he was so shy he couldn't even speak up in court. Nelson Mandela was an angry black nationalist. To create change in the world, they first had to change themselves. But you can change. You can start today. You can find like-minded people, and you can create a solution to a problem. Maybe if you don't have a lot of resources, maybe that's going to be a smaller change. But that small change is the first step along the journey to a bigger change. And I'd just like to finish up with one of my favorite stories from the book, and one of my favorite examples, which was the Otpor movement in Serbia that overthrew Milosevic. I mean, talk about a change with long odds. And these guys, they were really just kids in their 20s. They started out in 1992. It was an anti-war protest, and it was very similar to Occupy. A bunch of young students, and they had rock bands, and they were protesting the war in Bosnia. And then the summer came, and they all left, and that was the end of that of that movement. And then 96, there was some more success, and they won a bunch of local elections, and then Milosevic, who was the dictator there, he at first refused to recognize, and they had this big protest movement that lasted months, and eventually they got the election recognized. Although they failed to unify, and very, very quickly it fell apart after that. And then in 1998, just 5 guys, nothing really special about them, 5 guys in their 20s, or I think it was 4 guys and 1 girl. They met in a coffee shop, and they said, we really need to do something about this. And they formulated a plan. They said, we know that, you know, we know that we can get people to the polls for the presidential election in 2000. And we know if we can get people to the polls that we can win the election. And we know when we win the election, Milosevic will try and steal it. And that will be our chance. Not that they're going to win the election, but Milosevic trying to steal it will trigger mass protests. And that's what they prepared for. And that's what happened. And in 2000, that's what happened. I think it was a year later, Milosevic was at The Hague. Few years later, he died in his prison cell. So that's, when you talk about change, it didn't happen in one day. But, you know, 5 ordinary guys joined by 6 of their friends a day later, so 11 founders, created a movement that I think by the end was 70,000 people, and overthrew a dictator, and has since then turned into Canvas, which is a movement that helps similar protest movements around the world, and has created change in I think something like 50 countries. So that's how, even starting very, very small with very few resources, that's how big you can get it to be. So before Marie signs off, I just want to say thank you to everybody for attending. I know and I'm sure Pia as well really appreciated your questions, which were great. And you can feel free to connect with both of us on LinkedIn. I think we have, yeah, there it is. So thank you very much for attending, everybody. I thought it was a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes. So yes, please, we have Pia's and Greg's information up here. They are both very active on LinkedIn and love connections. So please, if you're not already connected, feel free to connect. And then of course, there's also their digits on how to get in touch with them and read more and learn more about Quest and learn more about Greg's work. His book is amazing. So you should definitely get that and read it if these ideas that we talked about today are useful to you as you do your work on change and transformation. We will make a recording of today's session available so that you can share that and you can go back to it if you want to. And then I think there's only remaining to say thank you so much for joining, for being so active and engaged. It was a thrill. I know we've had attendees from all over the world, and Greg is in Pennsylvania and we're here in Copenhagen. So it really feels like we've got our own little global movement, global conversation going on. And we very much appreciate your time and attention. So thank you for this time. Pia, will you just say thank you so we can see your face one more time?
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure. I will see you another time.